Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And we're continuing Where Women Month with Spring from, I'm going to get the first names wrong, so let me...
Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead.
Aaron Benson and Justin Moorhead.
Them's the two. Yeah, they made a movie called Resolution. They also made a movie called The Endless, both of which were fairly prominent in the sort of indie genre scene. They got some film festival play and some good buzziness, and you and I like both of those films.
Yes, and I think we'll bring them up at some point. But before we do that, quick call to action. We want to thank Ian for becoming a Patreon subscriber, a premium subscriber over at patreon.com/genrevision. Thank you, Ian. Seriously, the Patreon subscribers are what are keeping the lights on, folks. You're keeping the show alive, and that is not an exaggeration. So we want to thank Ian and all of our Patreon subscribers. If you want to get access to all the cool stuff Ian has access to now, go to patreon.com/genrevision and become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. We've got weekly pre-show discussions. The one we did for this one is a doozy. I won't say any more than that. But we've also got uncut episodes of our show Fin Flicks, supplementary episodes for stuff like Third Time's the Charm, extended currently consumings, which we're going to be doing very soon here with our Genre Vision sister, Danny. Hi, Danny.
Hello, Danny.
And a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you just want more of what we're doing, patreon.com/genrevision. So we're continuing Where Women Month with Spring, which was a movie I believe you suggested to me, Travis, because you knew that I enjoyed the other films that Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead had done. And this was the only one of theirs I hadn't seen. I remember seeing the trailer for it when it came out and just never getting around to it. You actually wrote a review of the film back when we wrote for the website Chud. And out of the 3 feature films of theirs that have been widely accessible, I know they have their other one. I think it's called Synchronic, that I don't think has gotten distribution yet.
Yeah, we've heard lots of interesting things about it, but I don't know if it's gotten any play beyond festivals.
I don't believe so. I don't think it's gotten a deal in that regard. And of course, I'm going to see it as soon as it's available. But as far as their filmography is concerned, Spring was the only movie that I didn't see a lot of returning discussion happening about it. And that always, I think, gave me pause and was one of the reasons I didn't seek it out. But now we've done it for Where Women Month. And I will say, I think it's them trying to be more accessible. And in that regard, I think Spring actually ends up being my least favorite film that they've done.
Well, I mean, if you look at their other 2 prominent entries that we're familiar with, and that's Resolution and The Endless, both of those I think kind of fall into mindfuck categories. Like they're mindfuck movies. They're playing with the art of cinema in a way. They're playing with time. They're trying to be sort of interesting and twisty in that regard. You know, they're trying to be sort of an intellectual exercise at the same time as being a genre film. This isn't that kind of mindfuck movie. It's a little bit more straightforward in that regard, but it's also, instead of being a straight horror film, I feel like the film is primarily a romance. You know, that's its main conflict. That's really the basis of what the narrative is structured around, is 2 people falling in love and trying to figure out if they can make it work or not. So I think at heart, the film is certainly a romance. The film is about a character named Evan, played by Lou Taylor Pucci. You might recognize Lou Taylor Pucci as the blonde guy from the Evil Dead remake with the glasses who actually reads the incantation and later gets the syringe shoved into his face.
I think the movie opens in a way that I did not expect, and opens in a really strong way with Lou Taylor Pucci's character, Evan, at his mom's deathbed. This is the first scene of the movie, and he's kind of caring for his mom, and she tells him this joke that I actually laughed at, but it's a morbid joke. And as she dies and exhales her last breath, he's
abducted by aliens. No, I'm sorry, that's Guardians of the Galaxy. Shit.
Yes, that is a different dying mom one. And this opening, I think, is actually better in terms of being much more straightforward and effective in the moment, as he's telling her, his feelings and trying to say the last things he's going to say to his mom, but he's too late. It immediately sets up the movie as something really, like I didn't know that was going to be what I was walking into right out the gate. And it knocked me off my feet.
Well, I think we see so many kinds of movies like this where we have an American who goes to Europe to have fun. And I think so many of those kinds of movies were expected that this is a person on vacation. They're here to have a good time and they're here to fall in love. But it actually presents his trip to Europe as an escape, as sort of a last resort.
It's mourning.
Yeah. Well, it's something that he does on impulse out of grief and necessity. Like, not only does he have his whole mom to deal with, now he has somebody who is potentially looking for him who may kill him.
Yeah, so he gets in this fight at this bar that he works at, and this person continues to follow him later, and they're like, oh my God, this guy's going to show up and with all of his friends and beat me up with baseball bats, so I need to get away for a while. And he ends up going to Italy. And one of the reasons I've always stayed interested in what Benson and Moorhead are doing is I think they have a real knack for editing a movie and potentially writing for the edit.
They do. I think they have a fairly solid vision of what the movie is going to be on paper when they write these things. That's the impression that I get from watching these movies, because they have some really solid transitions built into their work. Like early on in the film, before Evan leaves for Italy, he is hooking up with this woman, and he's so drunk that he's falling asleep while, making out with her. And they eventually fall asleep while she's sort of laying on his chest. And there is this really beautiful match cut to morning where he's in bed alone and the light in the room has changed. And it's not the kind of match cut where the frame matches perfectly, but the rhythm of that cut is so offbeat that it catches you off guard, and it sort of snaps you into an alertness. Oh, something is happening. Like it's really beautiful cut. And these two guys have a knack for that. Their movies are always like this.
Yeah, I think they're really good at managing the pacing of the movie through the edit. And I think that's apparent in Spring. So Evan eventually flies over to Europe, and he's in Italy, and he's for a while palling around with these English dudes who it's like, okay, is this the adventure he's going on? They're going to become kind of his posse, his foreign friends that he makes and stuff.
Yeah, luckily they're not in the film for very long, and which I'm grateful for, because they're both annoying and the film knows it, I think.
They are. I mean, they're being somewhat comical as well, but I think it's another attempt to disarm the audience from what you think this movie's going to be. And it's successful in that. They eventually leave, and Evan decides to stick around because he walked up to a woman at this bar, this woman who we eventually find out her name is Louise, played by Nadia Hilker, and kind of struck out, but there was clearly some amount of chemistry between them, and I say the word chemistry for specific reasons, which we'll get into. He eventually sees her again, and he's starting to pursue her. And before we even know something supernatural is going to happen, this is clicking into a very classic two-person formula with romance movies, in which you have a kind of classically uptight person, which is Evan, and then a life-loving adventurer type that's going to be, in some regards, this would almost be considered the manic pixie dream girl.
You took the damn words right out of my mouth.
Yes, she is the free spirit that's going to help heal him of all of his woes and everything, and that's the only service that she provides in the script.
But the movie doesn't fall into that trap. Like, it actually builds her into like a person with an autonomy and like an order to her life that makes a lot of sense. Like, her character's a scientist, and not only do we actually get to see her at work, but we actually do get to see sort of what her domestic life is like without Evan. We get that in little bits and pieces, and we understand her motivation for why she is. So I think they do a good job of painting her, not as this manic pixie dream girl, but also implying that this is a person with a life that is totally independent of Evan.
Yes, and as the movie reveals itself, we'll see exactly why she is this way. But eventually they're hitting it off, and they're kind of spending more time together. And we start getting hints that something weird is going on. And it's mostly tied to shots of nature because Evan starts working on this farm, and there's a tree that all these things are happening with the tree that are obviously very metaphorical to the story itself, whether it's getting this strange rotting fungus or, more importantly, that there is a tree that is producing two different types of fruit, lemons and oranges.
Right, which is just done through a graft. But it's symbolically important. One of the things we eventually come to learn about Louise is that she has two different colored eyes, and she initially hides this fact from Evan by wearing a brown contact lens in the eye that's off color. But as they start to know more and more about one another, the key dynamic in Spring is working really well. This is a romance. It's all about the dynamic between these two characters, and that includes, romantic chemistry on screen, but also just includes, things like, do they share a good rhythm of dialogue together in the scene? Is there sort of, an alchemy here? Is there something being constructed? Is there proper synthesis of a relationship on screen? And yes. Nadia Hilker and Lou Taylor Pucci, they've got what it takes to make their scenes work together.
Yeah, I think that they're both very good actors in the role, and I think the script by Justin Benson, credited to Justin Benson, I think does a good job of making them come across as actual people. They're movie characters, but they don't feel like movie romance characters.
Right. They've got snappy movie dialogue that real people don't say, but at the same time, it's not falling into holes that a stereotypical movie romance would. This at one point, I think Evan says that he's living, that sort of like housewife fantasy. And I think of movies like Under the Tuscan Sun or something like that, where it's this, woman who middle-aged who moves to Europe and has this sweeping romance. And he remarks that he's sort of having that for himself. But it's not really true. It's more of a joke than anything else. It just sort of acknowledges the framework of that romance in Europe. And, being wrapped up in this new place that has all this history, things that Americans aren't used to. It's very overwhelming.
That's all I think feeding into Spring as a genre refutation of that stereotype. Because yes, that is a stereotype of a movie, that an American person goes to a foreign country and the exoticness of that country is tied into whoever their romantic partner is in the movie as well. They represent each other.
And it's almost always tied to a sense of personal reawakening for the protagonist. And to call the movie Spring is directly related to that, because spring is a time of reawakening. We've always in culture associated, the springtime with the reawakening of nature, with reproductive cycles and fertility, blooming, all that sense of nature changing and waking back up is something that's constantly reinforced in this film. And it's echoed in Evan's character arc, as somebody who is awakening to himself and to a new self.
Well, the peaks of this coming through Supernatural that we first get is they finally really start making out in an alleyway. And I love the framing of this movie so much. There's so many good, smart things going on in the background framings. And this is one of them, where the movie frames them kind of in the background, out a little bit out of focus, making out against the wall of this alleyway. But in the foreground, in focus, we just see a flower start to bloom. And it's very obvious and literal stuff as far as the metaphor. But in terms of the actual supernatural stuff that's going on, this is when we start getting hints like, okay, what is Louise?
Yeah, well, and the movie is full of these kinds of images. This is one of the movie's best strengths, or maybe its ultimate strengths. Aside from the character chemistry and the character dynamic, this movie is constantly trying to put images in front of us that will juxtapose. So I would say that composition is a strength of this film. The look of the film is something that I'll get into a little bit later, sort of, more technical, but in terms of composing images and juxtaposing things on one side of the frame with things going on the other side of the frame, this movie has an obvious strength. And it also does that with sound. Sometimes you'll hear certain things in the sound design that will echo or complement or amplify what's going on in the scene. Like, I think it's the scene where Evan and Louise are walking to his place to have sex for the first time. And you can hear a cat in heat caterwauling in the streets.
Yeah, I like that the movie has this kind of this reinforcing of the ties to nature that's going on and how that's going to become more and more apparent as to why that is. Because I give the movie this, and I think this is, when you're talking about the strongest aspects of it, I think this is one of the best aspects of the movie, is that for the majority of it, it kept my interest and intrigue into what is Louise? Who is she? Because we know just from, you know, by having it in Were Women theme month, you know that something's going on with her. But the specifics of it were the right kind of elusive, because every little piece of the mystery of what she was that the movie kept feeding me didn't answer a question. It only got me more and more intrigued.
Right. It's the mystery versus confusion thing. You know, you can pile on questions and you can confuse people, or you can build mystery.
One of the first times that we see her, and it's clear that, like, okay, something's happening with her skin, and she knows it's happening. She's hiding it. She goes off somewhere, and it looks like she's just turning into a wolf. And you're like, okay, she's a werewolf, but it's not going to be a full moon type lore. There's something else going on here. But then we see her transforming other times, and it's not a wolf. It's other creatures. And I'm like, okay, what is this? And to the movie's absolute credit, I think anytime it is showing off transformation effects, which are short shot lengths and often framed in very kind of specific close-ups to avoid seeing like full body effects a lot of times. But when it's showing off its effects for this level of a production, I think it's damn impressive.
This is where you and I are going to start to disagree, because conceptually, this movie is really ambitious, because there are effects that it calls for that are pretty surprising. You know, the transformations, while we do initially see them in small shots that are easy to do with, you know, practical makeup gags or small short CG gags, they eventually get really, really ambitious in that we're seeing full creatures from head to toe. Some of the practical stuff that we see in the start of Evan and Louise's relationship is really good. You know, whether it's just a small makeup appliance on her thigh, or, you know, there's this incredible shot. I think she's in a bathroom in the middle of the night. She's transforming, and we see these bumps come up on her spine, and then the bumps travel downward. And it almost just looks like it almost just looks like a string of beads, you know, really big beads being pulled down under her sweater.
Loved that shot.
You don't even see skin. It's just through clothes, but the effect is nevertheless incredible. I mean, absolutely remarkable. But as we move later on into the film, the effects do get more and more ambitious. There are some shots of things like you'll see veins pop up on her skin. You'll see, you know, new facial features appear. And it's clear that these aren't all 3D effects. Some of them are 2D effects, and they don't all work very well. And I may have different standards for this, or I just may have certain pet peeves about it, but I think it contributes to my overall sort of feeling on the film, in that while Spring is an incredibly fascinating movie, mostly on paper, I think there's a lot in the execution technically that I find lacking. And it's things that wouldn't be deal breakers for many people I know, but for me, they add up to like a frustrating sum. There is a sense that, like, okay, the effects are spotty. Like, there are some effects in this movie that I think are absolutely incredible, and we'll get to that. But there are some that I find really tough to look at. There is a scene early on where Louise discovers that her transformations aren't something that she can continue to put off using this medication. There's something that she injects herself with that appears to help resolve some of the smaller transformations. Like if she has a weird patch on her thigh, she can sort of inject this stuff in and it'll resolve it. But eventually she finds that that's happening less and less. She can't control it. So she eats these 2 rabbits that she keeps in her apartment, but she goes to some like cave and draws symbols on the wall. And there are these like rather long shots of her that they've warped to make her look extremely thin. And this stuff just looks awful.
There are two moments as far as the effects that I will agree with. That wasn't one of them, but I also attribute that to, I don't know. They clearly know they can't pull it off the way I think they want to. So in that shot, she's very far away from the camera and in shadow.
Still though, I mean, she's nude and like there's so little to hide. So you see the effect on full display.
It's true. I don't disagree with that. But for me, it worked. It was not, especially in comparison to some of the other effects in the movie, I think impressive. It was just like, oh, okay. That works. It wasn't, and I think that's a risk you run in effects films in general, is if you have effects that are really good, if you fumble something, even I would consider this a minor fumble, but still a fumble. When you have that as a piece of comparison in the same movie, it is only going to heighten how unsuccessful you were at pulling that particular effect off.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this unevenness that we're talking about with effects is something that I see throughout Spring. I mean, earlier I complimented the sound design about how they were using sound effects like the sound of the cat in heat to sort of reinforce what's going on in the story. But then I listened to dialogue that was recorded on set for certain scenes, and I'm going, they needed to ADR this. This sound is not good. And these we talked about bad sound mixes and the kind of effect they can have on a filmgoer's experience. You know, Underwater. You and I both like Underwater. The sound mix in that movie sucks. Mm-hmm. Now that I have that movie on home video, I have the benefit of being able to watch it with subtitles. But these sorts of things add up to sometimes a really cheap feeling. Like there are some times I watch Spring, and in certain scenes and in certain moments I'm going, holy shit, these two guys are so good at milking every ounce of production value out of this incredible Italian location. But then there are other scenes where I'm going, yikes. You know, there are just some times where they really fucking drop the ball and they just make their movie look cheap, which I feel bad sometimes for criticizing because clearly this is a low budget film, but it's also an ambitious film.
Well, I also think horror is a genre that people who love it are willing to be a lot more forgiving with things if you come to the table with strong ideas.
And if you're delivering on the basic pleasures of what people are expecting from that subgenre or whatever.
Potentially, yeah. But I think that the benefit of Spring is that its strong idea and the mystery of what Louise is enough to kind of keep you going, even if some effects don't get pulled off 100%. We'll get to the third act when everything kind of gets on the table, because I think there's a big shift that happens there. But I like that the movie was able to maintain this mystery in really fun ways. Like you say, you know, she goes to the cave and starts painting symbols. I'm like, okay, like I was messaging you. I'm like, okay, so she's got to be some kind of like ancient deity, like some this is happening in Italy. So she's got to be some kind of like Greco-Roman mythological figure or something. I kept getting sucked into the movie's mystery. And then later they're at a restaurant and somebody at a table is eating octopus, and she reaches inside and she realizes she's transforming again, and she comes out and she has squirted ink on herself. I'm like, what is, she's like, so then it becomes like, is she taking in attributes of animals that are around her? Like all of this stuff was whirling in my head. And that was actually one of the moments that I felt was one of the effects that I didn't think worked, is that earlier in the movie, Evan sees this one particularly brash American tourist who is just a cartoon of a person.
Oh, just the ugliest American. Yeah. And he later finds Louise partially transformed on the street, like sick, basically. And he comes up and sexually assaults her. So she turns around and literally rips his dick off as a snake person.
Well, and that's the when she turns up and you see her face, that was, I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at. This looks muddy.
Yeah, that one of the things I criticize the movie about is looking muddy generally. I do not like the overall aesthetic of this film. You know, I've talked about how the composition is good, like how they'll place certain objects within the frame. I think Benson and Moorhead have a really great sense of how to arrange things in front of the camera and how to arrange a scene. But when it comes to the actual look of like how this is as an image on the screen in front of you, like
the aesthetic.
Yeah, it's fucking Instagrammy and hazy, and I'm not sure which cameras they shot it on, but so much of it is just sort of like, why the fuck would you make your movie look like there was a thumbprint on the lens throughout the entire fucking thing? It baffles me.
I was kind of neither here nor there about it. I was like, okay, this is how the movie looks. It didn't bother me, but I also wasn't in love with it or anything.
Some of it is obvious, like they're trying to capture a 16 millimeter or an 8 millimeter kind of feel, but it was shot on digital, and they make it shot on digital. That's fairly apparent. There are things in the movie that kind of reveal that it was shot on a bunch of different kinds of cameras. There are some prominent drone shots in the film that make it known, like, hey, this is a fucking drone shot. Get used to it. So some of the stuff is just, really beautiful in the fact that they were in a beautiful location, and they have sort of an Instagrammy color grading look to this movie. But a lot of it is just sort of washed out, hazy, desaturated in a way that I found was just kind of ugly. And I'm not here for that. I just don't think it's all that good looking. And when you have these really beautiful locations, I don't know, I felt like they were kind of just like rubbing grease on something that didn't need to have grease on it.
Well, I think we should move to the more interesting element here during the story, in which Evan does finally discover that Louise is something. He shows up at her apartment, and she is on the ground as a mutated half-were octopus person.
This scene fucking rocks.
The reveal of her on the ground is phenomenal. It's goopy and gross and shocking, and I messaged you just fucking ew.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great combination of good practical effects and really good CGI.
There's one bad digital shot when it does a reverse shot to Evan and there's a tentacle flopping around in the frame. It just looks very pixely.
Yeah, it looks pixely, and it's not matching the shutter speed accordingly.
Right.
So it's flopping around in the foreground, and you see Evan in the background. So it doesn't quite match the motion blur correctly, or it's just something off about it. But then, like later on, he severs that tentacle, or that tentacle falls off her.
It's practical.
And they have a rubber practical tentacle that they're clearly just have on a monofilament, and they're just yanking the monofilament up and down.
It's great.
And that's fine, and all they had to do was paint a wire out.
So Evan then earlier in the movie, he had discovered a syringe on Louise's bathroom floor and was like, what's going on? Like, I don't want to judge you or anything. She's like, no, it's a medication I take, and it's a long story. So eventually, when he shows up at her apartment and sees her as a cephalopod person.
Cephaloperson, thank you.
Yes, there you go. He grabs the syringe, injects her, and she transforms down. And this was the scene that I'm like, all right, here it goes. Like, they're sitting at a table, and there's a very cute, self-aware moment in the script in which Evan asks her, he's like, are you a vampire, werewolf, alien, zombie?
Witch. Yeah,
Witch.
I screen capped that and called it the 5 genders.
Yes, and it's like, okay, this is the genre. It's like, well, I think about one of my favorite things in Tremors is when all the characters are sitting on the rock and they pretty much come up with the only explanations for what the monsters could be.
I bet it's aliens.
Yeah, he's like, I think it's aliens. No way. There's something prehistoric, or they're a government experiment. And it's like, that's kind of what it could boil down to, but it doesn't really matter. And in this scene, it's a moment of self, meta awareness, saying like, well, you audience expect it to be something like this, and that's not what it's going to be. Now, this, I think, is a critical turn in the movie. And while the rest of the movie isn't bad, I think this is where the execution in the script, I think it takes a turn that it doesn't quite succeed at. Because on paper, I see the intention and the mindset behind the decisions that happen in this last act. But I think the way that it's executed doesn't come off well. So you have these two characters sitting at a table, and we know that this is the moment. This is the explanation moment. But then Evan walks away. And while he's walking away, Louise decides to follow him, and this is when the explanation happens. Now, I bring this up a lot on the show as a concept that was described to me through Lost, which is called the shot computer, which is if you need to explain a difficult piece of your movie's or story's lore, instead of just having people sit down and talk about it, have some action going on.
Right. Give them a problem to solve, a conflict, a rather immediate conflict to resolve.
Right. So that ethos is here in this scene in Spring. The problem is the way that it is delivered only confused me as a viewer, because the explanation for what Louise is very complicated and unique.
Right. Louise, as we've discussed before, is a scientist, and what she studies is genetics. And it's revealed that she is in this particular town in Italy because there aren't a lot of immigrants to this town. So it is a genetically sort of unique population. And so it is eventually revealed that she's a geneticist because she's studying her own genetics. And she is this creature that is functionally immortal. And the way that this creature is able to sustain itself is once every 20 years, it has to get pregnant. So it has to mate with some sort of male human. And while Louise says she is human, that's not necessarily true. She says that, but it's like, I'm not quite sure that's ever a thing. She has to mate with some dude, and the biological process that sort of controls this this immortality function, it will take the DNA from this dude and sort of remake her and incorporate that guy's DNA. So every 20 years, she basically is sort of reborn as a slightly different looking person with all the same memories. So she's been around for like 2,000 years, she estimates. She originally came from Pompeii, and she's chosen Evan as the new guy to provide this DNA for her eventual rebirth. And he's caught her sort of at the end of a cycle where her body is, to quote her, going crazy. So she's experiencing all these transformations going up and down the sort of evolutionary chain. And so we're seeing cephalopods and reptiles and, other types of mammals, sort of dog-like creatures, cat-like creatures. This is the sort of scientific explanation, but the movie is clearly hinting at something else.
There's another factor here. The injections that she was giving herself were stem cells. And she says that if she doesn't inject herself, that she regresses to different evolutionary, things from our evolutionary history, I think is what she says.
Right.
And that these stem cells literally stem off the transformation into these beings. And that's what the eventual fetus that she's going to absorb, that's the purpose of it, is eventually she will absorb that, she becomes a new person, and then she's got 20 years before she's got to do it all again. However, the wrinkle in the thing is that if she decides, or her body decides, as she says, not to absorb the fetus, she would stay who she is and stay pregnant and lose her immortality and become mortal, because we later, towards the end of the movie, find out that that's what her mother did. I buy all of that once we sit down and say it. The problem is, in delivering this information in a scene where characters are running through an alley and she is trying to say this at a clip to try and get Evan's attention, the movie knows that this is complicated and is delivering it in a complicated way because it has to reiterate it from Evan's perspective later in the movie.
Yes. So at this point in the film, Evan has, I don't know, maybe he's overstayed his visa or something like that. Immigration police are coming for him because he's an American tourist who is now trying to illegally establish a residence and employment here in Italy. And the cops don't like that. So they're looking for him. They're trying to chase him down. And so she delivers all this exposition about her state of being, what kind of critter she is, to him while all this is happening. So I get why they would try to sort of freshen up this exposition dump, or just this big info dump at this point in the movie, by using the sort of police chase as a framing device or a way to keep things fresh. But yeah, like you're saying, it's not entirely successful at what it's trying to do.
I like having all of the police stuff happening in the background. Like you'll see the police are investigating the murder of the brash American that Louise killed, and that's kind of happening in the background. The immigration cops keep.
I do like the scene where the immigration cops show up at the farm, and the old guy who's been taking care of him tells him to run. I think that scene's pretty good. The old guy who takes care of him is a great actor, Francesco Carnelucci. This is one of his last roles.
Yeah, I like his role in the story as far as kind of being a figure for Evan to look towards. Like it's like this is what I want, you know, and
thematically he serves a really important purpose too.
Yes. But this I think is where the movie loses me, because it decides that, you know what, we're going to kind of subvert what you expect from this kind of genre story. The monster's not going to go on a rampage. They are not going to have some showdown or anything. Instead, Evan decides like, hey, you've got this much time left before you absorb my genes and become a different person. Let's just spend it together and having a good time.
Because we're in love, even though they've only known each other for a couple weeks.
Yes, and Louise puts out that it's like you may not even really be in love with me because I put out some kind of pheromone, and that's why flowers will bloom near me and you know, animals go crazy around me. I'm putting out a pheromone that is made to attract you so I can, you know, have you as a mate to continue my life cycle. So she has very cynical feelings about the potential of feeling love at all, because she only sees it as a purely biological process. So all of this is thematically very interesting and worth picking apart, but the movie in the end is just, all right, Evan and Louise are going to hop around Europe some more. And
it becomes a road movie, yeah.
And it's nice because I like these actors and I am invested in their romance, but the movie kind of just, I don't know, it feels like it slouches at the end. The drama of what's going on isn't reflected in the action or tone of the movie. And I feel that is a very conscious decision by Benson as a writer and Benson and Moorhead as the directors, that they want to do this subversively. And I applaud the desire to do that, but again, I think the execution is what fails.
So, I mean, and I think this third act reaffirms what I stated about this, is that this film is primarily a romance. And so the conflict and the eventual resolution are all built around, will these two characters fall in love and will they be happy together? And that's really what we want to know by the end of the film. And the end of the film does certainly answer that question. But I think if we look at it through the lens of like, okay, this is a movie with a monster in it. It has had these certain sorts of conflict in the movie thus far. You know, we expect sort of a climactic thing. Like even Louise says like, oh, if I transform, the last form I transform to is going to be the biggest, nastiest monster you've seen yet. And the movie sort of sets this up like, okay, as a monster movie guy, I want to fucking see that. But it doesn't deliver on that. And the reason it doesn't deliver on that is because of information that's given to us. And this is all about whether or not she decides to absorb this fetus inside her, or instead she decides to use her own genes. Well, actually, I'm misspoken. It's not really a conscious decision on her part.
Her body decides.
It is, yeah, it's all about chemistry. It is all about the oxytocin levels in her body. So whether or not she is feeling love, she will decide. Her body will decide on its own, subconsciously, to make her mortal or allow her to stay immortal. And so really what it's giving us is a biological structure for a fairy tale to exist. And it is the tale of, will this fairy creature become mortal because she has fallen in love with the mortal?
Yes, classic Lord of the Rings. I'm going to lose geek points, but I can't remember the story that Arwen and Aragorn, the famous, the elf who gave up her immortality to be with the mortal. It's a classic, mythological thing.
Yeah, well, I think this, like you said, this kind of harkens back to Greco-Roman stuff. Like, it's no coincidence that this takes place in Italy.
Sure,
and it's the kind of tale where it's like a god fucks a mortal, which happened all the time in Greco-Roman mythology.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, got to make those demigods somehow. But this ending also, when they get to Pompeii and Louise is showing Evan the calcified corpses of her mother and father, and saying, this is, my mother, she gave it up for this guy and, wanted to have me. And this is the moment that it's like, okay, is it going to happen? And this final shot in which Evan is sitting there and she's laying in his lap and he's kind of caressing her hair and he's talking kind of about his philosophy about love is a complete loop around to, okay, this is how the movie started. He's, getting to talk to his dying, or rather dead, mother, but he was too late. And in this time, he's like, I'm not going to be too late. This is the last moments before potentially I'm going to be murdered by a were thing, or this is the woman I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. And as far as like from a purely academic standpoint, I give that ending a check plus, because it's like that is what you should do. That's perfectly bookended. And the shot with the sun rising in the background, it's like, yep, you're knocking off all of those boxes. But it didn't hit with me emotionally.
It's a little chilly. It's a little distant. They don't play it, I think, for all it could be played for. I definitely sort of knock some points off for that. I like what the movie is going for in theory. Again, it's all cool on paper, but the execution of it is just a little chilly. As a romance, I think they could have taken that a step further and really given us a more triumphant note to go out on. It's certainly not a note of defeat that the movie ends on, but I think they could have elevated it a little bit more. This is a script full of ambitious ideas, but I think this movie sort of overreaches a lot, and it overreaches in terms of a lot of the technical aspects. I think there's some really rough VFX in the film. The end result doesn't quite look as glossy as it could, but then they'll do stuff like add digital birds into a drone shot, and I'm like, well, that just doesn't look very good. I don't like that this really ambitious and thematically rich script is sort of tainted by some really ugly low budget execution. Like that for me is sort of unfortunate. And I certainly applaud low budget filmmakers like Benson and Moorhead as far as what they're able to do on their extraordinarily limited budgets. But like this one, I was like, you guys reached a little too far on this.
Again, those elements weren't the deal breakers for me. The deal breaker was that for a movie that hinges on the romance of these two characters, and the big climax is, are they going to stay together? Which is kind of a cliched conflict for all romantic stories. I wish that by the ending, I felt strongly about, yes, she does decide to become immortal and stay with him.
It needed a San Junipero ending.
Whatever it needed something stronger, because like you're saying, as a monster movie fan, it's like, oh yeah, there is an implication during this shot that is zooming in on Evan that she is transforming just underneath the frame, and it's like, and we hear it too. There's like monstery sounds. There's like slurping and yeah. But of course, like the monster fan of me is like, I want to see it, but that's okay. I appreciate the artfulness of that decision.
Sure,
but the fact that the emotion didn't hit, considering that I liked the romance and the chemistry and the performances between these two actors and the relationship between these people as characters, the fact that it didn't hit resonates very strongly for me, that I'm like, something was off. And I don't know if it was just that last act kind of taking a very decidedly left turn that switched something off in me, or something else. I don't know. Spring, I still enjoyed watching it quite a bit.
Sure, I think it's a pretty decent flick. Like I wouldn't rate this as a bad flick at all, but I think it's hindered, rather severely by certain aspects, and it's certain weaknesses in the writing, and for me, primarily certain weaknesses in technical execution. I think those are just the biggest things for me. I understand that a lot of people just won't get hung up on that stuff, and that's fine. So I'll own that. That's a me thing.
I will also say, because I said this to you when I was screening it, that Benson and Moorhead's movies all have a very particular mood and rhythm. And I think that it is a mood and rhythm that is likely to be very off-putting to most viewers. And in a way, Spring is kind of their most accessible from a from a screenwriting, from the pure narrative perspective, but that mood and rhythm is still there. And I like it. Like it's something that I'm like, okay, this is part of their thing. I've learned how to click in with it. But I think Spring could have been even more accessible. And I think by doing that, it might have been able to hone in on the really interesting aspects of its script and characters. But maybe it would be less unique. At the end of the day, I think I would call it my least favorite of their movies. But like you said, not a bad movie. It's just my least favorite.
Lou Taylor Pucci is a great lead, and Nadia Hilker does a great job with her role. And together, the two of them make a really interesting pair. Something we didn't mention is that in the first act, we get to see Jeremy Gardner, who is the actor, director, writer who made the little indie zombie movie called The Battery. He also just had another movie come out on VOD earlier this year called After Midnight, and both of those movies are really good. So I was really happy to see him pop up. So the movie is full of, I think, of little gems like that, and also, you know, Angelo, the old guy who owns the farm that Evan works on, like his scenes have such a unique tone and rhythm to them, and he's got this sort of old world wisdom to the character that is really beautiful, I think. And what he represents thematically is certainly important to the movie, because he talks about the kind of the grief that you leave behind when you agree to fall in love with somebody who is mortal and who could die before you, and what it would mean for you to be without them. And so he represents sort of a potential future for Evan or Louise. It's a really crucial part of the movie, and one of the more beautiful parts of it. I think this is a movie with a lot of beautiful stuff going on, but has some pretty significant flaws. And for me, like I've said, mostly on the technical side.
Well, let's end things talking about the werewoman aspect of this, because this was something that I sent to you when I was watching it, is that when we first meet Louise, when we first see the inklings of her supernatural abilities, it seems to imply that they are activated by sexual attraction. Mm-hmm. And I sent to you, I was like, is there a werewoman movie where the transformation element isn't connected to sex or kind of sexual chemistry? Like in the case of Ginger Snaps, it's like, well, this isn't, it is certainly a metaphor for budding puberty and everything, and sexual chemistry. But all of the movies that we've been doing, it's like, oh, okay, I think this seems to be the theme that's developing, is like, if it's women turning into these things, and with the exception of Ginger Snaps, these have been movies written by men, that it must have to do with their sexual agency or their sexual biology. And that certainly ends up being true of Spring. But once the movie revealed itself more, it wasn't completely about being activated by sex.
Right.
It certainly tied into that, though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the first times we see her transform pretty completely, it's right after she and Evan have sex for the first time. So she wanders into an alleyway and she sort of looks like dog-like or cat-like, and she ends up killing an alley cat.
I'm intrigued because we have one movie left for this month, Howling 2. Your sister's a werewolf.
Oh, sorry.
It has an even better title, but I'll save that for the episode. And I'm wondering if at the end of this, are there werewomen movies out there that aren't using the metaphor of transformation for women to be just tied into their sexual identity and sexual biology?
Yeah, if they're not about sexiness or about reproduction, like if there is woman transformation into creature or monster that doesn't have to do with the sort of sexual aspect. If that's out there, I really would like to know about it, because
because we pick these movies, and some of them we haven't seen, or some of them we aren't exactly sure about how the theme is going to come together. And this was not intentional, where it's like, yeah, this is just something that's been developing throughout. There's other thematic things that we've looked at in terms of the transformation aspects in these movies, but they all do boil down in some way to be about female sexuality. And when you look at the gender, the kind of normative, I should say, gender opposite of male transforming characters in media, I think it's easier to pick a variety of different reasons why, what the metaphor of transformation is here.
Right. Hulk is all about anger, for instance. It's about emotion and passion.
Sure, anger, I think, would be a typical male thing, even, werewolves and stuff. But you have something like Jeff Goldblum's The Fly, where it's like, oh, this is about cancer, or, the hubris attached to scientific exploration.
Sure.
I would like to find were-women movies that don't tie in the transformation aspect to sexuality. And I'm there's got to be something out there.
Or giving birth, reproduction. I mean, I think so much of these stories written by men about women transforming are kind of about the horrors of what men witness as women do go through pregnancy. Because from the male perspective, and keep in mind, I'm only speaking as an individual here, the fact that y'all can just make another human in your body. And even though I have a fairly decent scientific understanding of what the fuck's going on in there, that's still freaky as shit.
It's body horror.
It's total body horror.
I mean, the idea of an organism growing inside of you that will eventually escape you. I'm like, oh, that's the plot of Alien.
Yes.
It's like there is a horror to that. And I think a societal horror from a stereotypically male perspective about being like this thing, which, it has beauty in it as well. But at the same time, the pure biology of this can be very horrifying to men. And the representation of what that means, all of that, it's certainly intriguing, but more so than just digging into the specifics of what it is in Spring, this was kind of the movie that we hit a wall where it's like, is this all that it's going to be with were-women movies? Is sex and reproduction?
Or was this, a failing on our part where it's like, well, could we have chosen movies that maybe represented a sort of a broader swath of what the idea of women transforming into monsters could capture? Like, is this so limited to sexuality and pop culture, or is there more that we're just missing? And I would love to know things that we are missing. I would actually prefer to believe that we are missing things. I would love to be enlightened by someone else to tell me, hey, there is this really cool thing you missed and you should totally look into it.
Agreed.
So I'm happy to. If people can suggest things, I will happily look into them. And we would love to talk about them on this podcast.
Agreed. Well, let's head over to the shelf where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to genrevision.com, comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks, and we'll feature them on next week's episode. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Spring?
I do not do this often, but the shelf is all about pairings or substitutions. And today is a pairing. And the movie I'm going to choose is actually the lesser of the two in this pairing. This is a much worse movie than Spring. But the two follow such a similar template that I really just had to bring it up. And I had been curious about revisiting this movie for some time because it has a really rotten reputation. And this movie is American Werewolf in Paris. So this was the, 1998 sequel to An American Werewolf in London. And, oh boy.
Yeah, I saw this movie at least twice when it hit home video. I saw it actually before I saw American Werewolf in London. And I have always had this like morbid curiosity about revisiting it because I don't remember a lot of it, but I only know of it being widely derided and absolutely vilified. And from what I pick up in contemporary reviews and certainly your reaction, that reputation is more than earned.
Yeah, this movie's a total garbage heap. I mean, you have these Americans coming to Europe, and of course, in the sort of hostel or like Euro trip tradition, even though this kind of predates it a little bit, the central three characters, the first of whom is played by Tom Everett Scott, who you might recognize as the lead from That Thing You Do, and he's actually really good in that movie, but he sucks here. This movie is ill-advised and just poorly executed from the first few scenes. I mean, it's an utter failure as a horror movie because it barely even attempts to be scary, and its actual attempts at being scary are pure failure. It's not funny. So trying to be a horror comedy. So the idea that this American would come to this, foreign place in Europe and fall in love with this really, beautiful European woman who in this movie is played by Julie Delpy, and she's a monster. She's a werewolf. And it's implied that she's actually the child of Jenny Aguter's character from American Werewolf in London. That whole idea is executed so much better in Spring that it actually made me more grateful for Spring. American Werewolf in Paris is all of an hour and 45 minutes long. It feels like 2 hours and 15 minutes. It is an utter slog. This movie is so bad. And the characters themselves, just to be around them, they're so incredibly grating that is the movie's sort of like instant death sentence. Like, even if so many other things had gone right, just to be around these characters is just, a cheese grater on the ears and on the eyes and on the brain. I wish that it had done more interesting things with the idea of these werewolves in Paris, but they never do. And as an effects film, it's just fucking rotten because there are practical monsters in this film, but the whole ethos behind all this is you're only going to see the practical elements for only a few frames at a time, and most of what you see as far as werewolves will be digital. This was 1997. This had a relatively high budget. I think you said it was $25 million. In 1997, that was fairly significant. Mm-hmm. And this is an ambitious effects film. Like, there are shots that you can tell were designed to be showcases for boundary pushing digital effects. There is a scene where Tom Everett Scott's character is making out with this woman in a graveyard in Paris. I think they're on Jim Morrison's grave. Or maybe that was in one of the screenplays I read for this, but he eventually starts transforming into a werewolf and he dives into a fountain. What jumps out of the fountain later in a couple seconds is this big, fully transformed werewolf. And so you see this big creature erupting out of water in slow motion, and you see the whole thing in the frame. And then it lands, and then it shakes like a dog in slow motion. And so you can see this water simulation, you can see the fur simulation. And for 1997, all of this was ludicrously ambitious, and it all looks like shit. In a sense, it's one of those effects films that had to be there to push boundaries so that it could actually push the art form forward. But I would take Spring and its sort of spotty digital effects any day over an American Werewolf in Paris. Sir, what are you pulling off the shelf this week?
Well, if you want another supernatural art house horror film that takes place in a foreign land with a female monster character, how about you check out A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night?
No shit. You're actually going to pull this thing off the shelf.
Yes. I mean, there seems to be a feeling from Travis that I don't like this movie.
I think you think it's too arty.
Which I enjoyed it. I definitely think it's a very arty film, but that's not always a bad thing.
Nope.
It's a very gorgeous black and white movie. I will definitely give it that. I think the romance in this is actually really well executed.
Yeah.
Because the perspective is far more from the girl, as she's credited, played by Sheila Vand. I think having the perspective be from her, and she is an outright monster and a great one. I think Spring having to jump between perspectives sometimes, I think actually it adds to that muddiness. It's I think either committing to Evan or Louise's perspective could have helped hone certain aspects of the script. And I like that A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. I love every moment that we're with the vampire monster. She's very unique. She cuts a wonderful image as this skateboarding character, and I can't remember the specific name for that headdress that she wears.
Chador.
Yes. She looks like a superhero. It's fantastic.
And it's like what Guillermo del Toro says about monsters. It's like if you can imagine a monster in repose, like that's typically a sign of a good monster.
Right.
And we see a lot of her sort of just chilling out in her own apartment, listening to music. There's one great scene of her where she's just sitting in the bathtub, and it's like, yeah, I like being with this monster when she's not at all concerned about being a monster. She's just existing.
Sure. I will totally say that I feel that the movie is extremely hipster friendly, but again, that's not always a bad thing. It has a very specific mood to it, and it commits to the mood in a really great way. And it helps that writer-director Ana Lily Amirpour, she just kills it. Like, she's just a good filmmaker.
Hell yeah.
That, I think, is one of the biggest assets in that film's arsenal. So I especially after Spring, I'm doing kind of the opposite with you, where I'm like, I think I'd watch A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night again. Like, it really kind of hits certain things. And again, I like that her monster element isn't directly tied into her feelings about sex or anything. There's certainly some strong messaging going on in that movie as far as how she feels men view women and view her specifically.
Yes.
But that's not what her monsterism is directly about. There's more layers to it. It's a little bit more complicated, and she's a little bit more complicated as a character.
And I like that, you know, there is sort of a feeling of transformation in that film. There are some scenes where she has to sort of put on a different vibe. Like, there are some scenes where she's specifically trying to scare people. There's a scene where she's trying to scare a little boy.
Oh, it's my favorite scene in the movie.
It's so fucking cool.
It's my absolute favorite. That's like the scene I would take out of that movie to be like, watch this. This is great. Like, this is just the best thing, where she's scaring this little boy and being a full-on monster. Wonderful. Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. A movie I like more than Travis thinks I like it. Listener shelf picks for last week's episode on Species. Whole bunch of them, and a really great variety. Thank you so much. I love all of these. Neil Tazad's shelf pick was Hustlers. Another movie about, quote, predatory women making men pay for their horniness, also told with sympathy from their perspective.
It is true. What a great shelf pick, and what a great movie.
Yeah, he said, I think you guys have already talked about it on a previous show, but I was blown away by its storytelling and craftsmanship. He talks about it a lot more. But yes, we mentioned in some currently consuming, we loved Hustlers. Hustlers ruled.
I had it in my top 15 from last year.
It was, I don't know if it cracked my top 15, but it was way up there.
It's so fucking good.
It's great. Mr. Milksteak had to. He said, well, first I'm going to go with Species 2, which I just wrote an article on Species 2 for Bloody Disgusting. Travis and I love that movie. I think it's a creature feature masterpiece, as my headline so boldly states. But his other shelf pick was another human-alien genetic hybrid, Alien Resurrection. If you're looking for a loosey-goosey B-movie set in the Alien universe, this one has a decent ensemble cast, some interesting ideas, and some really bad ideas, which he says is the newborn alien. Woof. I like the newborn, but maybe one day. I mean, I did all the Alien movies with Nick when he was the co-host, but maybe one day Travis and I will sit down and talk about some of the Alien movies, because we could talk about them forever.
Sure. Yeah. Even if it was just an episode where Drew and I are just going to spew all of our feelings on Alien. Who knows?
Maybe. We'll see. Eric Fuchs mentioned, when we were talking about Species needing a remake, he said, didn't we already get that with 2013's Under the Skin? That's going to come up again. But his shelf pick, he just says, screw it. Life Force. Which, hey, we did an episode on Life Force. Go listen to it.
That's a literal boob lady movie.
It is. And our good loyal listener, T-Bones McRoanoke, went with Sphere. I know you guys are Sphere appreciators, so sorry if I'm crunching your Crichton. That's okay. Go. We did our Sphere episode. But he says it's another 90s sci-fi horror blend that has its moments, but truly does not rise above the sum of its parts. Go listen to our Sphere episode. We love it.
I mean, would you rather people listen to our Sphere episode or watch Sphere?
I mean, why not both? JT's shelf pick, which was a movie we talked about. We should have put this on. You know, we talked about it off mic because we were talking before we recorded about remaking Sphere. And then we both were like, oh, there already is remaking Species. And there already is a good Species remake, which JT had for his shelf pick, Splice. If you're going to go sci-fi genetic shenanigans with a healthy dose of smuttiness, this one's got it. Absolutely. Splice pretty much is the unofficial Species remake in my book now.
Yeah, I watched that fairly recently, and it held up. It's pretty good. I mean, very icky, but very good. Jetpack
Jesus went with Under the Skin because I haven't seen it, and revisiting Species made me remember it exists and want to check it out. I liked Under the Skin, but again, Travis liked it way more.
Yes. Now, I actually do think I called that movie a masterpiece.
I believe that. And Steven Nesbella actually said that it's interesting that we were going to do Spring because that's what he thought about. But then he decided to go with Grim Prairie Tales because he got a flashback of it. Because one section of it, that's the only section he's seen, has haunted him. And it is kind of the only thing I know about Grim Prairie Tales, in which a man travels across the prairie, encounters a pregnant woman walking alone across it. He offers her a ride to the nearest town, and on their way there, the two flirt, and he really starts to like her. She gives him the look, they start to have sex, and he is then slowly and horrifically sucked into her vagina. Steven says, I never watched the rest of the movie. My 11-year-old mind was scarred for life. Yes, I've seen that scene from that movie, and that's all I know about it, other than also has Brad Dourif and James Earl Jones in the wraparound.
I've seen the opening scene from that movie, and that's pretty much it. I had never committed to watching the full thing. I will one day.
Yeah, it's anthology horror. I feel like it's a big, blind spot for somebody like me who loves anthology horror. So might be that time. So thank you, everybody, so much. Wonderful selection of shelf picks this week. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Very quickly, I just wanted to say I rewatched the 90s Casper live action film today because you watched it today. You were writing a thing about it. And I remember liking this quite a bit as a kid in the mid 90s. Keep in mind, I was born in the late 80s. So I was in my late single digits, maybe in my early double digits when this came out. I'm not sure in the exact year because it's not important.
Suffice to say, you were the prime demographic for Casper.
You better believe it, because I certainly had a childhood crush on Christina Ricci, and that's pretty much like what this movie is about. Like that's Casper's whole perspective. Is like yes. He is her Instagram stalker. Anyway, I had an odd thing happen to me in this movie because I liked it so much when I was a kid, and I hadn't seen it since then. I was like, oh no, I bet this probably hasn't held up. It's probably really bad. And as I was watching the opening moments of it, the Universal logo comes up, and they did a custom Universal logo for this movie where it turns into a moon. I thought, uh-oh, what if this is like really, really bad? And I had to take a moment to comfort myself and say, you know what? It'll be okay. It's just a movie.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that we've talked about with, having to revisit stuff and being open to the idea that something that you have a very warm, nostalgic memory of and that you held very close to yourself has the potential now to not replicate that feeling and could even be bad. But I don't think that was the case with you or I while watching Casper.
No, bizarrely, against all expectations, this movie holds up. Then again, like, I'm not holding it to a terribly high standard because the movie and the way it presents itself, it's like, this is a goofy live action cartoon and it delivers on that. Okay. So it's accomplishing what it's setting out to do. It's not an incredibly lofty goal, but it hits it nevertheless. So, props given for that. But also something that I didn't realize as a young person watching this movie was like, this movie actually hits really hard with its thematic elements. And it's about some really tough stuff thematically. Primarily the way that the movie is talking about its themes is all about death. It's all about what is left behind when someone you love dies and what happens when you die. I mean, the movie addresses these things really directly. It is not skirting around them. It is not trying to tell a glib story about death. It tries to embrace these things really sincerely and eventually ends up going really maudlin with it, which is not the best way that this story could have ended, I think. But for the most part, it's like, this movie is handling itself and its themes with sort of an unexpected confidence. Is it a good movie? I think by its own standards, it's pretty good.
I think like you're saying, it meets the goals it wants to while also being surprising in a lot of thematic ways for kids movies at the time and even now.
It's basically a live action cartoon about death.
The ambition to tackle those themes very directly for a movie intended for very young kids is bold. It's this is an Amblin movie, and this is why not everything should fall under the monolithic rule of Mickey Mouse, is that they were willing to go to some places that I think, especially at the time, other entities that were creating children's entertainment weren't willing to. This movie has lines of dialogue about death and mourning and what it's like to be dead that kind of put me on my ass when I watched it today.
It's fucking wild. At one point, Christina Ricci asks Casper what it was like for him to die. The movie actually approaches that with a degree of sincerity that I found astonishing. I mean, legit shocking. Whoa.
It comes from a place for the character and from the writing of genuine kind of childlike curiosity.
Yes.
And Casper's response, my God, when he says it's like being born but backwards. And then he talks about how he's forgotten who he was, which is like, okay, which becomes a narrative drive for the movie. But when he talks about it, he says, I guess when you're a ghost, your life doesn't matter much anymore, so you forget. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah, well, it betrays this core of deep sadness. And the movie is driven by that idea of sadness because one of the primary characters, and the whole reason these characters move into this haunted house in the first place, is that Bill Pullman's character is a therapist for a ghost, which is such a patently silly idea that somehow the movie turns to its own advantage. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. The two screenwriters for the movie were the two credited screenwriters, I should say, were both screenwriters they were both writers for Animaniacs. So the script is really fucking zany, but it also has some jokes that will go over kids' heads and landed really well for me. Like, it was all stuff that would have gone over my head back when I really loved this movie. But now, as somebody in his 30s, I'm like, all right, there's some stuff for me in here. All right.
Yeah, and it's not. I can see it being seen as kind of adult pandering, and there's certainly some of that in the movie.
Sure.
But I really appreciate its thematics. I really found it on this watch to be like, wow, this movie is more grown up for a kid's movie than I remember it being. And that's always kind of rewarding to find in material that you saw as a kid, to realize like, oh, there's a lot more going on here that I probably was not picking up on as a kid, not just with, jokes or material or anything, but with what the movie's trying to talk about and communicate to kids in a way that maybe they won't understand on the surface, but it'll plant a seed in their brain.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it messed me up for life. Who knows? Anyway, what, sir, have you been currently consuming?
I got a screener for a movie called The Vast of Night, which will be premiering on Amazon Prime on May 29th. Got to see this movie. This is kind of a wonderful little low budget Twilight Zone-esque sci-fi story. It's set sometime, I believe, in the early 60s. I don't remember exactly. But the basic story I can tell you is that there's the big school basketball games going on, and everybody in this really small town is at the game. And our two main characters, one of who is a switchboard operator for the phones in the town, and the other one is a late night radio host. They're both friends. And during this broadcast of the radio show, a weird signal and sound comes across the airwaves, and the switchboard operator notices it. She calls the radio station and says, hey, I picked up this sound that's coming in and that played across your broadcast. Can you loop it and play it on your broadcast again and see if anybody knows what it is? It's really weird. And then somebody calls in to the radio station and says, I recognize that sound. And we're off. This is a kind of a tiny marvel in terms of low budget filmmaking. Some really ambitious stuff going on. It's a wonderful little small production. It's got a very, very stage play presence, which I think could put off some people, and a lot of people will have the complaint that nothing happens in the movie when there's a lot happening in terms of the characters and the rising tension of what's going on and the mystery of what this is. It's a movie that's going to be rolling around in my head, I think, for the rest of the year. It's small and it's ambitious, and it's not going to be what I think a lot of people want out of a particular type of genre experience. But for me, this is like the best Twilight Zone story that I've seen probably in 25, 30 years. It definitely puts the recent CBS show to shame. And there were some episodes of that I liked, but this is like, and the movie knows it. There's some very direct references to the Twilight Zone that you'll see. So highly recommended, but just know it is low key, very low key, but I got chills. I was completely leaning in as the movie continued on. Highest of recommendations, Vast of Night.
All right then.
And we're going to close things out with our
comment of the week.
This comes from Neil Tazad, who mentioned something that I meant to mention in the Species episode, but totally forgot, which he said, it's so weird that people now say Species is the origin of the Chupacabra urban legend, when I swear I've heard people talking about the Chupacabra way before 1995. Now, before we started recording our pre-show for Species even, I mentioned this to Travis, and he had never heard of this. This theory that Species is the origin of the description of the Chupacabra. Now, from what we looked up, the earliest report of something that was called the Chupacabra dates back to 1985.
I thought it was 95, but
well, I think when I looked it up, as far as a description, as far as saying like this is what this thing is, it was 85, but there was no physical description of it.
Got it.
It was just kind of a, this is, what we're naming it. This is what this thing is. But nobody had a like, I saw it kind of count. It wasn't until 1995 when this woman who gave the specific account. And if you look up and you've seen the classic, it looks like a gray alien with these very protruding spikes on its spine, is the classic illustration of the Chupacabra. There is an investigation that some guy did where he feels that description was influenced by her seeing the movie Species and how Syl is portrayed in the movie. It's fascinating. I the efficacy of it is certainly worth questioning, but it is a weird little tidbit about Species now that I think will forever be attached to that movie.
Sure. I mean, if y'all want to believe, then, God be with you.
It's either that
I
or
look up images of the Chupacabra, and all I see are pictures of dogs with spines.
Okay.
A lot of like coyotes with mange,
Okay, I see. So maybe, who knows? Syl, there's the Species remake. Syl is the Chupacabra. So we will be closing out Were Women Week next week with Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf, which both Travis and I have never seen. It is a notorious movie. I'll say this. I was going to save it for the actual episode, screw it. I adore the original title of this movie.
Which is?
Sturba, Werewolf Bitch.
That'd be a fun one to play around with punctuation.
Yes, I don't know if that was the original title and then it was retitled to be a Howling movie. I know in some international markets it was marketed as Sturba, Werewolf Bitch. Fantastic title. Love that title. But I'm excited. At the very least, it's probably going to be a travesty that Travis and I will weather together, which is always fun. So, as always, we want to thank you all so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week
when I transform into a monster here on Genre Vision.
Travis is the werewolf bitch.
I'm a werewolf. Bitch.